All right, so welcome back this afternoon. In this session, we're going to think about long-term tangible and measurable goals to make sure that we have a more person-centered and inclusive clinical trials enterprise. And the long-term now is 2030. So we talked about 2025 earlier, so this is a little longer term. So what are some of the actions and the goals to consider? Amanda, may I ask you to pull that up on the screen again? That was really helpful. But I'll tell you quickly what they were. The goals are to build a sustained clinical trial network that invests in community over the long term and maintains trust through ongoing and longitudinal relationships. And I think we heard a lot about that in the previous 3 calls we just had. Re-examine the role of contract research organizations to better foster longitudinal relationships with communities. That'll be an exciting one to tackle. I think that is an interesting one. And what are some other long-term goals to ensure a more person-centered, inclusive clinical trial enterprise? Maybe we'll start there. Is there a goal that that really should be added here that we don't quite have for us to get to that more person-centered and inclusive clinical trial enterprise?
So Pam, I don't know if this applies here, but one of the things that hasn't shown up in your goals and we haven't talked about is sort of the role that collectively we can play in educating and mentoring students at a much younger age around becoming health literate and what clinical research is. I have a daughter that's in a residency program right now, and I was quite astonished, that she had no exposure to clinical research, what it is, why it's important in high school, didn't really have that much in college, and really minimal in medical school even. So I think there's a role from a policy standpoint to try to include some of these things in the curriculum, because that's sort of the foundation, both in terms of educating a community, but also, setting us up for the future, for the workforce of the future. If you don't happen to know somebody in clinical research, how do you even learn about it? Like, where is that opportunity? So
that's a really good point. And let me just also reiterate that if you have something to say to maybe use some of those reactions, pick any one. They all look kind of cool. Maybe not the crying one. Maybe we do need the crying one because this has kind of not been good for a while. Maybe we need to change something. So pick one of the reactions, and that way it will be clear to me that I can call upon you. But that's a really good point. And I've actually volunteered to go to the school of my kids to talk about clinical trials in times of COVID. I thought it was sort of an appropriate thing, but there wasn't quite the appetite I had hoped there would be. So, yeah. Any additional thoughts around sort of I guess it comes down to awareness, both like as an opportunity to work and create that workforce, and maybe also then on the other side as an opportunity to become a participant in the future.
Well, also, if you're trying to increase the minority participation as clinical research, physicians and things, just, mentoring kids in high school so they can even get into a college and even get into medical school. There's just this whole, component all the way through that, but to wait till they're in medical school to give them some training is way too late. We need people down in the high school level, and they can go home and, talk to their families, et cetera.
Yeah, good point. Anyone else want to jump in on that thought?
I can share that just to build off of what she just said. I think it's important to also realize that the clinical trial enterprise, while research physicians are at the center of that, they're not the only component. And I think that, personally speaking, I recently participated in something called Health Professions Week, which was geared towards high school and college age students. It was a virtual program and sort of shared my own story of, being the typical, undergrad pre-med. All I wanted to be was a doctor, and sort of how I didn't land in medical school, but where I landed was right where I needed to be. And so I think I just want to build off of that, because I think not just high school age students, but I think even college age students. Like if you had told me when I was an undergraduate at UVA that I would be doing what I'm doing now, I just didn't even know that was even, an opportunity. Like when I was in high school, it was if you wanted to be in the medical professions, you were a nurse or you were a doctor. Those were sort of your two choices. And I think that now, as sort of part of this clinical trial enterprise, there's, we've seen this on the COVID side, a call for hiring of clinical trial educators, getting those out to our sites and into the community. And so again, just sort of, again, with that focus of building that next generation workforce, I think we should put more effort there and make that sort of more, I feel like that's a very tangible and measurable thing that could be set for 2030, to see more programs like that exist. Thanks.
I'd like to chime in real quick. I'm not sure if anyone is measuring the adoption and usage of health information technology, tools, trackers, devices, applications by race, ethnicity. And, if we don't have adoption and adaptation to those tools, as a long-term goal, it's going to be increasingly more difficult to get participation in the clinical trial enterprise. No,
I think that's another aspect. Yes. Any other thoughts on that, or something other related to the goals?
I mean, I guess just sitting here as an editor, I'm trying to think how it sounds like this really needs to straddle so many different disciplines, right? And this sort of patient-centric or person-centered approach needs to really be integrated into many, many different disciplines, so that people doing things like tracking how digital devices are used, that this is a problem in their eyes, because it's not the medical profession that's necessarily doing this. So I think so many of these areas, when I look at what we publish, have been so underserved for so long. So how do we really put this at the heart of everything, I think I don't have a solution. It just seems like a very serious problem.
Yeah, I won't pick on, just maybe to put a finer point on it, I won't pick on, a particular continuous glucose monitoring company.
Mm-hmm.
But you do not see one person of color in their TV commercials, right? Even though insurance is paying for the device, right? And diabetes is pandemic in communities of color.
Right.
Right. And so there's just some of these things I think should be part of our long-term tangible and measurable goals. It does come back to the adoption and usage of technology, many times, the ability there. And are you invited because it's culturally appropriate and it looks like yours? There's a multicultural marketing plan associated with it, and so it's targeted at you. And many times,
right,
that's not the case.
Or are you kind of excluded by being not targeted and by being made to feel as it's not something you can do? I think that.
Yeah, Linda, it looks like you have some comment. You might have to put yourself off mute. Yep, there you go.
I'm just trying to think of some really tangible goals here. I think the technology one's a good one, but I want to go back to sort of how you build out the infrastructure and suggest that, we need to be measuring the increase in the number of new investigators that come into clinical research and stay there. The ones that, maybe are community-based instead of just academic research. When you talk with people out in this community, there's certainly a very strong feeling that we need to expand and build out the infrastructure in terms of making sure we have sites and investigators in the right places, and that they have the right attributes that are going to help them connect with communities. And until we reach a point where sponsors are selecting sites that are not the same old sites and same old investigators, it's not going to change. So, I'd like to see some sorts of, measurable goals that we're going to increase the number of, naive investigators 10% or, something like that we can all sort of rally around.
Yeah, as we think about the trials of the future, and City did some work around this too, around this person-centeredness, we felt that there was an element that there should be an option for participants to kind of choose their trial experience a little bit more than what it is now, whereas now and so sort of I understand the importance of the sites, and sites will always be important, but how do you marry that with more of that technology aspect that you were discussing, Silas? If we're going to allow for remote visits because it's nicer for everyone, maybe on the one visits where you don't have to collect as much data, making sure that you don't leave anyone behind when you start having those options and that everyone has access to those options, because that is likely where trials are going to be somewhat moving to, in addition to into the community. And some communities don't even have hospital, like real community settings where they could go. So how do you make that happen? Because it's not just about a wearable device, a glucose monitor. It's about having Wi-Fi access and about having a computer and setting up systems so you can have access to a computer. I think the VA partnered with Walmart. So some people that didn't have computers or Wi-Fi at home could go to Walmart and do some visits. I think we need to start thinking differently, and how do you then measure that? I mean, those were some of the things we were thinking of at City like that. That's
Pamela, it's deeper than that too. In that, so again, I live in Cleveland, right? And if you Google AT&T broadband Cleveland redlining, something like that, it'll come up, right? AT&T was actually titrating down internet speeds in underserved communities and communities of color a few years ago, right? Slowing it down. So even if you had it at home, the deck is stacked against you. And, for what Lynn was saying, I absolutely agree with her. I just think there's many doors to get into these spaces. And, while we're pushing kids into STEM programs, maybe there's a career in developing health information technology that opens up a door into becoming involved in participating in clinical trials or helping to run a clinical trial. So I think it's all connected in ways, but there's so much inequity. There's so much systemic racism that it is brutal. And when you start peeling back the onions and looking at these things, it'll shock you unless you live it every day. So there's a lot to do here. And I don't think it's insurmountable. It's just, we just have to acknowledge what it is.
And we have to recognize all the inherent bias and sort of adversity that there is. It reminds me of that commercial on TV where all these kids are standing on a line, and if you have a parent that works, step forward. If you have, and then sort of, it was a very clear line at the end of the commercial where, some kids were definitely more privileged and had less adversity than other kids. And that kind of continues through. Michelle, you had your hand up. So,
yeah, I was going to just make a comment about back to the upstream involvement. We're talking about at the clinical trial node, but I think that in the developer of technology, I think there's need for diversity there, so that as they're building solutions, there's a thought of how it may perform in other populations, as well as considering those populations when they're amassing their clinical trials. I know that in medical devices, this has become a topic that we've been talking about quite a bit in terms of the innovator pathway, being more reflective of the populations that were probably using these technologies, so that those considerations are taken into account as they're in the design of the devices as well as in the design of the trials.
No, that's definitely another point, the diversity in the technology community. Valda, you also have a point to bring up?
Yeah, I was just going to ask a question of this group, really, and that is, if you want to bring in people who are more diverse, of course, which is what you want to do, and you really want to address systemic racism, the tasks that people are going to have to come in and do are what is the reward system? Because, the reward system in academics is so much based on elitism. And, so what is the reward system for bringing new people in, doing new things?
Anyone want to take that question? Or start some thoughts around there? Tina, do you have some questions with your NIH hat on? Some thoughts? I know you said you worked in vaccines, so maybe, that's an area you have done pretty well in at least COVID vaccines to engage with communities. What was the reward system there, or how was that approached?
I don't think that necessarily the reward in itself was ending the pandemic, and I think that because there was such a sense of urgency that never before have I seen this level of collaboration in my career where everyone was so focused on the same mission and vision and goal. And so, although our individual organizations may have had, a very specific role, together we were marching towards the same goal. I think that the question of a reward system is a very intricate one. Some things I can think of that we've done on the NIH side in terms of grants is, making it a requirement, for funding, that there be transition programs for mentorship, for some of our investigators who we've supported for many, many years, sort of like, a passing of the torch. Others may have different views on that. I can also sort of comment on, I know we're doing a lot of training internally on implicit bias and sort of addressing those within the NIH, just at our employee, just at an employee level, and then really thinking about that and how we project that out into the work that we do. I don't think that answers your question, but I think it's an important one that we should probably write down. I think that the COVID experience has incentivized industry in that the government has, in my opinion, and again, these are my own opinions, not those of the US government, that the government has sort of de-risked a lot of that upfront investment. And we did a lot of things in parallel and not sequentially. And that required a lot of financial investment and a lot of people time that was invested upfront. And that in turn sort of de-risked industry. It made it more appealing, to do those types of things. And I know that I personally struggle with that in the other epidemic that we're trying to fight, which is HIV, which is incentivizing industry to bring a vaccine to market as well. One that they may not necessarily profit on. And that's something I think in the COVID space that's going on as well. And so, again, I don't really think like I'm answering your question, but would welcome thoughts from others on sort of, sometimes a reward has to turn into a requirement, for certain things sometimes.
That brings up an interesting question because we've built up a lot of infrastructure. And Michelle, I see that you have, is that your old hand or a new hand? A new hand. Okay. We've built up a lot of infrastructure for around the vaccines and around COVID. Can we save any of that? Or are we going to really do what we always do, which is break it all down and then kind of go, ooh, we need people. Where are we going to find them? I don't know if that's a comment you can comment on, Michelle, and I'd be happy to hear, of course, the other thought you had. So,
no, that was my old hand. I didn't want to comment about the vaccines.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you don't want to comment on it? Oh, okay. Oh,
well, I can just say, like in my prior group, one thing that we talked about, and I think is still really relevant here, is like you just said, is capitalizing on COVID as the case. We can learn so much from what we've done, not only in what worked well, but what didn't. where we can be sort of putting our efforts forward. I know on the HIV side, that's something that we're very passionate about. You heard it in the talk that Margaret gave, and and sort of learning from the past in order to address the future. But and that we should be doing that with COVID. I don't think we've done anything like this on this scale before, at least in my lifetime. So, taking advantage of the infrastructure that was built, taking advantage, like we can't just abandon the communities that we've served, right? Once the vaccine has been rolled out. And Silas, I think a lot about a lot of the points that you made in terms of engaging the faith-based community, engaging communities of color, and really building and capitalizing on those trusted relationships. I know that's something that's very near and dear to Dr. Fauci, and a lot of what he's done on the HIV side is translated to COVID. And so, well, what about that really worked, and what about it can we keep doing? And can we do things like find an HIV vaccine after we've dealt with COVID and all other things that are affecting communities across the U.S. I think that it would just be such a waste of a good case study. And it's not just like writing down what we learned, it's actually figuring out, well, like what next, going to that next step. I feel like we do that a lot. We'll come together as thought leaders, develop recommendations, but like, what can we be doing to actually impact change? And, and we're not going to know what that is until we go out into the community and figure out what worked on the ground, what worked at the state level, what worked at the federal level. And we're not going to do that unless somebody's willing to write that down somewhere as a first step. But then we need to have a champion that's sort of going to keep moving that forward.
Esther?
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on the conversation and bring a point that came up in the Slack channel, which I agree it's very hard to keep track of two different platforms at the same time. But the comment in the Slack channel was really around, it's about the will, the resources, and the incentives. The human behavior responds to a combination of the carrot and the stick, and financial incentives matter in business decisions. And what strikes me in the context of COVID is the financial incentives were really high. And they are high because, of course, we're dealing with a pandemic. But whenever we have a shock to the system, that's how we respond. This scale is higher than we've probably seen in the past. I do think that when we talked earlier about a government approach and a policy approach, it seems like the right way to go, because when something is prioritized, something is funded. And it seems that the funding needs to happen at multiple levels. It needs to happen in funding community-based organizations, generally speaking, in health literacy and education that needs to happen on the ground. But there's also funding that's needed in the research pipeline. I think we had comments earlier in terms of education, students and increased movement towards STEM. But there's even increased funding for, having a diverse workforce, like should community health workers and others be redeployed. So I guess my comment really is reflective of that in the Slack channel, which is we're not going to see this prioritized until we see continued and sustained funding and a political will for all of the various agencies and stakeholders that are involved to make long-term changes. But we'll love others' reaction to that.
I have an immediate reaction too, because one of the things that I think we're going to have to turn to once this pandemic is a little bit behind us is how can we use the networks that we've created to kind of focus on other high impact health issues, like the chronic disease situation is not getting any better. Our mortality curves in the US are like going down, and it's a tale of multiple lines, and some are going down really steep. So can we reuse that for something that is probably, if you think about it, as important as what we're dealing with now? I mean, cardiovascular health, endocrine health, diabetes, all those things are I mean, they're not going away, and it's not being solved, and there's issues that need to be dealt with. Any thoughts on sort of being a little creative and like how can we create the network and sustain it? I think the sustaining is the part. We've shown that we're good about creating it, really good, but we need to be not the cat with the shiny toy, right? We need to try to sort of bake it in a little. What could we do? What are some of the goals? And then I think we'll talk a little bit more about contract research organizations too, but I think this is really key to maintaining and getting to a future is a clinical research engine that stays in place for all the important questions of our health.
So we know that communities of color and underserved communities of any color are disproportionately impacted by every chronic illness known to man, right? Yeah. And we also know they are predisposed to pandemic viruses like COVID. And whose financial interest is it in to help manage those chronic illnesses and to improve outcomes? So that would be payer organizations, by and large. So I think that this effort could translate, right, into something that payer organizations, CMS, and state Medicaid offices would be very interested in seeing take place, because it will reduce costs in the system, particularly as we transition to value-based care, where it really does matter. So.
That's such a great point. If I can jump in really quickly on that, Silas, because you're exactly right. Who has the long-term incentives within those communities that are reaping the costs and will have the incentive to move towards greater value? I would just say on the Medicaid side, because it's state funded to a large extent, there have to be incentives for significant savings for the states to invest new dollars if they're not reaping significant benefits from value-based arrangements in whatever manner that may fall. I mean, I think the hepatitis C case study with the subscription model is an interesting one. Can we think about that for other medications for chronic diseases more specifically? But I do agree with you that that is where the incentives lie, and efforts that CMS might make will make a long-term difference. One of the things that happened during COVID is an investment CMS made to reimburse providers participating in COVID trials. Can we turn that outside of COVID trials to very, very small, but just at least an acknowledgement that there is costs borne from participation? How do we take that and grow that without impacting the Medicaid trust, the Medicare trust fund? But I do agree that's a good starting point.
I know there's a couple more hands up, but I want to give a chance to Andrea or Sylvia or Liz to maybe chime in, because we haven't heard from you. And Andrea, I see you on the video. You're on mute. There you go. You're off mute. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, my perspective is that I'm here to see what role medical journals such as mine and broader scientific publishing can play in helping promote all of this. I think there's a lot that can be done, from the simple raising awareness by publishing comments and giving voice to patients, giving voice to a lot of the people who are running these initiatives. But I think there's probably more that we can do in the future, and thinking, in the long term, in the 10-year goal, maybe there's more that we can do in terms of thinking about what's requested, in terms of the reporting, in terms of there was an interesting suggestion in one of the breakout rooms I was in before, that maybe just the simple change that journals would have as a requirement that ethnicity in every trial is transparently reported, and that that is a requirement for any study that becomes mandatory. Maybe that is something that would show the dimension of the need to change this, and so yeah, that's very much my position here. I'm here to learn how we can contribute to solve this.
Well, it's an important voice, and journal editors' requirements can drive change. We've all seen that too. Brian, I know I think you mentioned you were with AstraZeneca. You've done big efforts during COVID. Are there any plans to sort of maintain infrastructure and sort of as a goal towards the future?
Short answer is yes, but I think we're struggling with how that's going to be maintained. I mean, as a company, we kind of the whole vaccine infrastructure had been kind of gone away from and then we went back to. So not only are we trying to do the infrastructure for getting into vulnerable populations where there's the whole other source for vaccines. But I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to embed it into the as we call it, the target product profile of the drug, and within the drug development, that it's built into the development program to have this as a key factor and a key success factor. And we're trying to put in support. I'm supporting from the data side, but we're also supporting. There's a focused patient centricity center that's working with each of the study teams. But I guess the answer is yes, but we're still kind of dealing with how we're going to actually do that.
And Linda, you had your hand up and down, and I think I didn't come back to you while you had your hand up, and then it went back down. So, and we have about 1 more minute left, I think. So.
I think one of the questions I hear from sponsors is, how do they make a longer term investment? And is it something that they do on their own? Is it something they can get together? Like, can there be an investment fund? Like, what's the right way to not be this one and done kind of thing? And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, we're certainly trying to look at what are the kinds of approaches and programs that you will look for when you're trying to, connect with investigators to help you with studies. But again, it's trying to provide those incentives and stick to it and not just keep going. Change management is hard. And unless somebody comes through and says, hey, we're not going to approve your drug if you don't do a better job of putting this diversity stuff in there, there's always going to be that tension between getting something done quickly, going back to a process and approach that's worked in the past, and versus, I think someone mentioned it earlier today, which is, it's going to slow it down, and that's just, again, it's what you're measuring, what you're rewarding.
Liz, I think you mentioned you were with BARDA, and I don't know if we have a whole lot of time, but it seems like BARDA may have a role in sort of funding, maintaining infrastructure. Have you discussed that? Is that on the table?
I think Tina brought it up. We actually worked together on a lot of the COVID vaccine trials, but the overall goal, and these are my opinions.
I get it.
It's really to have clinical trials, right? We want them to enroll quickly, and we want them to be, representative of the populace, either at large or in the country, or, affected with, the disease or condition. So, and I think this is really a multifaceted approach, and it's really nice to see people from various different pieces of, I guess, our economic, commercial, government and pharmaceutical infrastructure here all working on the same problem together. So, but I think, Linda, really hit the nail on the head. And it's just that sort of equipoise between, getting the diversity and doing it quickly. And it would be really nice to achieve both.
Yes, and I think we might all be receiving the notice now that we're going to be zoomed back to the main session. So thank you, everyone, for a stimulating discussion. And I don't envy the people who have to summarize this and kind of put it all back together on the back end. So thank you very much.